Usually when we talk about a person's political or cultural ideology, there's this, I don't know, this expectation of extreme precision.
Right, like it's a science or something.
Yeah, exactly. Like engineering, you look at someone's voting record or, you look at their demographic background, their zip card, and it's almost like looking at a medical x-ray.
Mm-hmm.
You see the clean white lines of their beliefs, you see the structure of their worldview, and the political analyst just points at the screen and says, there it is. They fit perfectly right into this specific box.
Right, because we inherently expect human ideology to be clean.
Yeah.
It's binary, right? Left or right, traditional or progressive, secular or religious.
And it's deeply comforting. I mean, we really like things to be visible, to be perfectly categorized.
Well, because if we can categorize someone immediately, if we can just, put a neat little label on their forehead, we feel like we understand the world.
Oh, totally. We want the world to make sense.
It gives us a sense of cognitive safety. The brain uses these categories as shortcuts, basically, to avoid doing the hard work of actual analysis.
But then you step into the world of modern identity and modern spirituality and honestly the absolute meat grinder of current cultural politics.
Oh, yeah.
And suddenly that ideological x-ray machine is just completely broken. It's sparking, it's smoking, and the image it spits out makes absolutely no sense.
Not even a little bit.
We are looking at a landscape of human belief today that is, well, honestly, it's murky. It defies every single clean, comfortable category we try to force upon it.
It really is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Mm-hmm.
And, the material we are diving into today is perhaps the ultimate crowning example of that exact complexity.
Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, you and I are diving headfirst into a massive, highly charged, and undeniably provocative conversation.
Yes, we are.
We are looking at a recent, super in-depth YouTube interview between host Winston Marshall and political commentator Blaire White. And look, before we get into the weeds here, we need to set the stage.
Definitely.
This interview touches third rails on both the right and the left. It contains highly charged political, cultural, and religious viewpoints. So let me be crystal clear here for you listening. We are not taking sides today.
At all.
Nor are we endorsing these views. Our goal is strictly to break down the arguments, to examine the psychological and societal claims being made, and just help you understand the landscape of this conversation.
Exactly. Think of us as your translators today. To navigate this material, we have to trace very specific and wildly unique narrative arc.
Right.
We are looking at how a deeply personal history of childhood trauma, specifically rooted in the occult, which we'll get into, led to a highly individualized spiritual awakening.
Which is a journey in itself.
And how that exact spiritual awakening now fuels a deeply controversial, heavily skeptical stance on modern gender politics, the institutional church, and what the speakers view as the intentional radicalization of our entire society.
Because to understand where Blaire White ends up on society and politics, you really have to understand where she started.
You have to understand the bedrock.
Exactly. And the conversation begins with a spiritual history that is, frankly, it's shocking. White reveals that she was raised in a bloodline-based occult, basically a witchcraft cult.
Yeah, and we really need to pause on that phrase. Bloodline-based.
Yeah, that stood out to me.
Because it fundamentally alters the psychology of a child. We aren't talking about a teenager casually reading horoscopes or, rebelling against their parents by buying a book on Wicca.
Right, it's not a phase.
No, the conversation describes a family-tied generational system. When a cult is bloodline-based, it means the authority structure of the terrifying anti-Christian practices she describes. It's inextricably linked to the very people who are supposed to provide safety.
Food and shelter. It's your family.
Exactly.
You can't just leave the compound because the compound is your living room. The people leading the rituals are your actual relatives.
And she describes these practices as inherently terrifying.
So imagine being a child in that environment. Your foundational understanding of the supernatural or the spiritual isn't about angels or a benevolent creator.
No, it's about manipulation.
Yeah, manipulation, fear, and dark rituals performed by the people who share your last name.
And what's fascinating here is the psychological response she has to that environment as she grows up. She explains to Marshall that her initial reaction to this immense spiritual trauma wasn't to run out and seek a traditional church.
Right.
It wasn't to look for a quote-unquote good religion to counter the bad religion. Instead, she completely dissociated from the concept of God or spirituality altogether.
Which makes complete and total sense.
She threw her hands up, built a massive mental wall, and ignored the concept entirely because it was simply too painful and, honestly, too dangerous to engage with.
I mean, if your only exposure to a hot stove is getting third-degree burns, your survival instinct isn't going to tell you to go find a different, nicer stove.
Exactly.
It's going to tell you to stay out of the kitchen forever. You shut that door and throw away the key. But then the timeline shifts. She details that around the age of 30, she hits a profound inner crisis. The mental walls she built to keep the trauma out start to crack. She's forced to confront the reality of her childhood, and in the middle of that crisis, she claims to have had a supernatural revelation from God.
And notice the mechanics of that revelation, because it's important. It doesn't happen sitting in a pew.
Right.
It doesn't happen because a charismatic pastor convinced her or because she watched some viral YouTube sermon.
Yeah.
It is described as a direct, sudden, unmediated experience.
And this completely dictates the specific kind of spiritual journey she embarks on. Because of her background, her distrust of organized hierarchical authority is just absolute.
It's baked in.
So her journey involves studying the historical Jesus entirely independently. There's this incredibly vivid detail she shares in the interview where she talks about spending a 2-hour car ride with someone named Joey.
Oh, right, the car ride.
Yeah, and for those 2 hours, they are just intensely researching new biblical passages, cross-referencing ancient texts, looking up historical context on their smartphones while zooming down the highway.
It is the quintessential image of decentralized modern faith. The cathedral has been replaced by the passenger seat of a car and a glowing screen.
It really has.
And it highlights a core theme that runs through this entire conversation. Christianity as a strictly, fiercely individualistic religion. She states explicitly to Marshall that she vastly prefers a one-on-one relationship with God over institutional church attendance.
Okay, but I want to push on this a bit because it feels like a pendulum swing. It's almost like running so fast in one direction away from a burning building that you end up entirely off the map you started on.
That's a good way to put it.
You just keep sprinting into the wilderness. I mean, if your trauma was inflicted by a highly structured, authoritative group, I get why you'd be terrified of a church hierarchy.
Sure.
But isn't a purely isolated individual faith dangerous? Winston Marshall actually points out in the source that without community, people go off into wild directions and form cults.
The very thing she escaped.
Exactly. How does the source reconcile this?
Is a brilliant tension in their dialogue. Marshall pushes her hard on the biblical mechanics of faith. He points out that a core tenet of Christianity is the commandment to love your neighbor.
Right.
And here's the catch: the defining feature of a neighbor is that you don't get to choose them.
Oh, that's so true.
They are simply the person placed geographically next to you. In an isolated, digital, or purely internal faith, you curate your community. You only interact with people you select, people who agree with you.
You can just block whoever you don't like.
Exactly. A physical church, however, forces you to sit in a pew next to people you might find profoundly irritating, socially awkward, or whose politics you fundamentally disagree with. And the mandate is to love them anyway.
Wow.
That friction is supposed to be the crucible for spiritual growth.
Because you can't learn patience in a vacuum. You need annoying people around you to practice on.
Precisely. And White actually concedes this point. She admits that she is still on an, quote, ongoing journey regarding this tension.
Okay.
She acknowledges the danger of isolation, but heavily leans on biblical passages that emphasize the kingdom of God being within you.
So it's a trade-off.
Yes, she is essentially making a calculated trade-off. She is prioritizing spiritual safety over spiritual community right now because her internal BS meter for institutional corruption is dialed up to 100.
She just cannot stomach the idea of submitting to an earthly authority.
Not yet, anyway.
And she does talk about the incredibly difficult reality of this individualized faith, specifically regarding the mandate to forgive. Because when you don't have a priest or a congregation keeping you accountable, you have to police your own ego.
Which is brutal.
It is. She talks about recently praying for her enemies. And she doesn't just mean abstract enemies. She specifically names YouTubers and internet influencers who had publicly slighted her or tried to ruin her career.
Right. Real people in her industry.
Yeah. She describes having to actively fight her own ego in that process. Her brain was screaming at her, pray for this person over here, sure, but absolutely not that person who made that video about you.
Overcoming that deeply ingrained ego defense is framed as a major milestone for her. It is a profound admission of the psychological heavy lifting required in an internalized faith.
Because forgiveness is fundamentally anti-ego.
Exactly. The ego demands justice, retribution, validation. To sit alone in a room and genuinely wish well upon someone who has harmed your reputation requires overriding your most basic psychological defense mechanisms.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Because that profound distrust of the institution brings us right to the front door of the physical church itself.
This is a major pivot point.
Yeah, because Blaire White is navigating this highly traditional, highly individualized faith as a trans woman, which forces the question, how does she interact with the modern institutional church when she does encounter it?
This is where their conversation pivots into a fierce, highly nuanced critique of progressive religious institutions.
Let's get into it.
So to lay the groundwork, White clarifies her own internal standing. She states she does not feel abandoned by God due to her trans identity.
Right.
Furthermore, she does not feel a theological rush to surgically undo her surgeries to please God, although she notably expresses profound respect for trans individuals who do choose to detransition for their faith.
Right. She makes it clear she doesn't feel she needs to cut herself up on a surgical table again to justify her relationship with the divine. But, and this is a massive but, she is simultaneously deeply disturbed by churches that go out of their way to explicitly affirm her specific demographic.
Yes.
She heavily criticizes progressive churches that fly transgender pride flags on their altars, or highlight non-binary priests, or host drag queen story hours in their sanctuaries.
And if you just look at that on paper, it seems like a glaring contradiction. I mean, why would a trans woman criticize a church for flying a trans flag?
It seems completely counterintuitive.
Right. But to understand the psychology behind this, we have to loop all the way back to her foundational trauma. The interview reveals a truly chilling detail about her childhood.
Oh, this detail stopped me in my tracks.
It's terrifying. She claims that her family's anti-Christian occult group actually had sympathetic allies working inside local Christian churches.
Wait, let me make sure I'm mapping this correctly. She literally saw, with her own eyes as a vulnerable child, the sacred space of a church being secretly infiltrated.
Yes. She claims these allies would literally hand over the keys to the physical church building on specific holidays, like Halloween.
Unbelievable.
This allowed the occult members to sneak into the sanctuary behind closed doors and perform pagan, anti-Christian, or mock rituals right there in the sacred space.
And it happened specifically because the people guarding the door, the people trusted with the keys to the institution, were compromised. They let the threat inside.
Exactly. The psychological imprint of that is massive. So flash forward to today. When she sees a church bringing in highly secular, highly politicized, or provocative elements, like a drag queen performing near the altar, her internal alarm bells don't just ring, they deafen her.
Because she views it through the lens of her childhood trauma.
To her, it is the exact same kind of institutional infiltration. It is the guards at the door giving away the keys to elements that fundamentally mock or dilute the sacred nature of the space.
And this introduces a concept from Winston Marshall in the conversation that I think is one of the most vital takeaways of this entire deep dive, the theory of suicidal empathy.
Suicidal empathy. It is a brilliant, if dark, sociological framework.
What does he mean by that?
Marshall defines it as a phenomenon within Western institutions, specifically the church, in this context, where the desire to be inclusive, to be politically correct, and to be seen as absolutely tolerant becomes the overriding directive.
So they just let anything in.
Exactly. The institution becomes so desperate not to offend anyone, so terrified of being labeled exclusionary, that it essentially leaves the front door wide open.
Yeah.
It dismantles its own immune system.
And think about how an immune system actually works in your body. Its entire job is discrimination.
Right.
It has to look at a cell and say, you belong here, you are part of the body, come on in. But you over there, you are a virus, you are foreign, you are destructive, and I am going to attack you and keep you out.
Yes.
If your immune system suddenly decides to practice absolute inclusivity, if it decides to welcome the strep bacteria and the flu virus because it doesn't want to exclude any living organism, you develop an autoimmune disease and the host dies.
That is the exact mechanism Marshall is describing on a societal level. It is the paradox of absolute tolerance. If a physical boundary or a sacred space refuses to exclude anything, it ceases to be a distinct space at all.
It loses its identity.
White makes a visceral analogy in the interview to drive this point home. She says that she fundamentally believes God loves strippers.
Okay.
Absolutely. A core Christian tenet is that salvation is available to everyone. But, she argues, that does not mean you want a stripper in full work attire teaching the children's Sunday school class.
Right. You can believe in universal salvation while still believing in strict, uncompromising boundaries for a physical sacred space.
This raises an important question that they grapple with. How do you balance the Christian mandate to welcome the outcast, the tax collector, the leper, the marginalized, with the absolute necessity of protecting the institution's core identity?
It's a tough line to walk.
White argues that celebrating or affirming a secular political identity inside a church is a massive structural imbalance. She argues for equality under God, meaning everyone comes to the altar as an equal sinner. But she fiercely rejects the merging of secular modern identity politics with ancient sacred tradition.
So to her, the flag on the altar is a sign of an institution that has lost its immune system.
Precisely.
But I have to push back here, or at least, play devil's advocate for a moment. How does she reconcile the messaging?
What do you mean?
Well, if you are a young trans kid who has been kicked out of your home and you walk by a church with a traditional cross, you might assume they hate you. You see a church with a trans flag, you think, okay, I'm safe there.
That makes sense.
How does someone who represents a highly modern, non-traditional identity hold such strict views on institutional boundaries without alienating the very people she's trying to reach? I mean, how does she balance making her audience feel not forsaken while condemning the very churches that try to visibly welcome them?
It all routes back to her core thesis, the primacy of the individual over the institution. She believes those flags and the progressive signaling are entirely superficial.
Interesting.
Worse, she views them as potentially manipulative, like it's a form of institutional virtue signaling that doesn't actually facilitate a true, challenging relationship with the divine. It's a marketing tactic.
Oh, wow.
She wants her audience, the LGBT youth who follow her, to find God on a one-to-one individual level. She explicitly wants them to bypass the modern church infrastructure, which she views as a compromised middleman.
Because in her view, the progressive church is hijacked by suicidal empathy, and the hyperconservative church might reject them outright.
Therefore, the only safe path is the 2-hour car ride with Joey, the internal kingdom.
And this profound, almost cellular distrust of permissive religious institutions maps perfectly onto a deep distrust of permissive medical and political institutions.
Yes, it does.
Which naturally transitions their conversation into the next massive cultural powder keg, the cultural tipping point regarding gender-affirming care, minors, and what the speakers term the post-COVID psychosis.
The timeline they outline here is incredibly stark. White notes that when she transitioned roughly a decade ago, the concept of transitioning minors was virtually non-existent in the mainstream.
It wasn't a thing?
Right, it was an anomaly. It certainly wasn't a sprawling cultural phenomenon. Now, she points out, it is happening to children as early as 12 or 13, and it's backed by a massive infrastructure.
And they specifically call out the political architecture supporting this, highlighting California's sanctuary state laws regarding trans youth, spearheaded by Governor Gavin Newsom.
Yeah, this part is intense.
They describe a policy landscape where if two parents are divorced or fundamentally disagree on a child's gender transition, the legal system inherently sides with the consenting parent, legally overriding and silencing the non-consenting parent.
They view this as a terrifying overreach of state authority.
Yeah.
It is the ultimate institutional overriding of the biological family unit.
Yeah.
The state steps in and says, we know what is best for this child's psychological and physical development better than one of the biological parents. But what's truly fascinating in this segment is the data Winston Marshall brings into the conversation.
The post-transmania data.
Exactly. He presents numbers suggesting that the cultural tide, this massive wave of youth transition, might actually be breaking and receding.
Let's look at these numbers because they are striking. Marshall cites data from Unheard magazine and the Center for Heterodox Social Science. They polled roughly 60,000 students.
That's a huge sample size.
Yeah. In the 2022 to 2023 academic period, 6.8% of students identified as a gender other than male or female. But recently, that number plummeted by almost half, down to 3.6%.
Wow.
He cites another specific poll from Andover Phillips Academy, a highly prestigious institution, where the number dropped from a peak of 9.2% down to 2.6%.
Whenever you see a statistical spike and crash that aggressive within a 5-year window, you have to ask the analytical question, what was the environmental catalyst?
Right.
Why did the numbers spike so sharply in the first place, and why are they dropping now? The root cause, proposed by both Marshall and White, is the psychological devastation of the COVID-19 lockdowns.
Of course.
The argument is that the lockdowns created a literal societal psychosis.
I mean, think about it. Imagine you are 13 years old in the spring of 2020. You're locked in your bedroom. You haven't seen your friends in 3 months.
It was so isolating.
The soccer season is canceled. The school play is canceled. Your hormones are absolutely raging. Your brain is doing the chaotic remodeling that happens in early puberty. And your only window to the outside world is a glowing rectangle in your hand.
That is a recipe for disaster.
You are desperately looking for an identity, for a tribe, and for a community. And you have a massive psychological void where normal human interaction used to be.
And what fills that void? Algorithms. This is a perfect storm of human vulnerability colliding with technological optimization. The algorithms on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube are not neutral.
No, they're designed to keep you clicking.
They're designed by the smartest engineers on the planet to maximize your visual engagement. If the algorithm realizes that a depressed 13-year-old pauses for, say, 2.3 seconds longer on a video about an identity crisis or gender dysphoria,
It will relentlessly flood their feed with that exact content.
exactly, it's an echo chamber on steroids. When you are alone in a room for a year, the internet ceases to be a tool.
Yeah.
It becomes your entire reality.
And the conversation ties this into a much broader, terrifying discussion about the skyrocketing rate of mental illness across the board. They mention a horrific statistic about children as young as 3 years old experiencing suicidal ideation.
Which is just heartbreaking.
The overarching argument is that an entire generation was abruptly stripped of traditional meaning, family interaction, physical play, religious community, local milestones, and they were handed a digital, hyper-politicized, algorithmic identity to fill the bleeding wound.
And White connects this desperate search for identity among LGBT youth to other destructive behaviors. She explicitly points out high rates of drug use and prostitution in these marginalized communities.
Right.
She argues that these youths are fundamentally seeking a duty to something higher, a sense of purpose. When healthy avenues for purpose are destroyed, destructive behaviors or rigid, all-encompassing ideological identities take their place.
But I want to challenge this narrative slightly and dig into the data they presented. If the numbers are dropping from 9.2% to 2.6%, are we seeing a genuine cultural correction?
That's the big question.
Right, like, are people actually waking up from a psychosis and healing that void? Or is this just political whiplash? Because let's be honest, identifying this way in 2022 might have gotten you social credit in a progressive school, but in 2026, it draws intense, sometimes dangerous political heat.
Very true.
Are kids detransitioning or dropping these identities because their mental health improved, or simply because it's no longer culturally celebrated and they are scared of the backlash?
That is a phenomenal distinction, and it's a tension they definitely wrestle with in the source. White expresses deep skepticism about politicians, specifically pointing at Democrats who are suddenly moderating their stances on these issues.
She thinks it's fake.
She views it as pure election optics and self-preservation, not a genuine ideological shift. Politicians feel the wind changing, so they adjust their sails.
Makes sense.
However, beneath the political maneuvering, she does believe there's an organic cultural awakening happening. She argues that young people are physically and psychologically realizing the long-term toll of the last few years.
The reality is setting in.
It's exactly the reality of irreversible medical decisions made during a period of intense adolescent isolation is catching up with them. The drop in numbers, in her view, is the fever breaking.
Which perfectly and somewhat terrifyingly sets the stage for the most expansive philosophical part of their conversation.
Oh, this gets deep.
Because if you start talking about the normalization of altering the human body and you combine that with a societal void of meaning being filled by technology, you inevitably scale up to a massive existential question. You start talking about the desire to transcend human biology entirely.
We are entering the territory of transhumanism and the theory of the top-down engineering of human culture. And the conversational bridge they use to get to this massive topic is actually a debate about surrogacy versus adoption.
Right. And White draws a very hard line here. She states she is firmly against surrogacy. She views it as the ultimate commodification of the female body, literally renting a womb for capital. Furthermore, she argues that spiritually and psychologically, the act of intentionally tearing a child away from the birth mother at the exact moment of delivery is fundamentally traumatizing to the infant's nervous system.
But she has a different view on adoption.
Yes. She contrasts this by supporting adoption, even for gay parents, but with a very sharp, specific caveat.
And the caveat reveals her entire value system. She supports adoption strictly if it is genuinely optimized for the welfare of the child.
Right.
She argues that placing a child with two loving parents of the same sex is vastly superior to leaving that child to languish in the state foster system or an orphanage. But she launches a scathing critique of what she calls influencer vanity adoption.
Influencer vanity?
Yeah. This is when a child is acquired almost as a luxury good, a prop to fulfill a highly curated archetype of a normal, successful life for Instagram or YouTube.
And it is that specific concept, the idea that a human child or human biology can be acquired or modified as a lifestyle accessory, that bridges Marshall to the concept of transhumanism.
That's the leap.
Winston brings up the writer Mary Harrington, who posits a fascinating, sweeping historical timeline. Harrington argues that the very first step in transhumanism, the desire to conquer, override, and transcend the biological limits of the human body, was actually the contraceptive pill.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the philosophical logic of that timeline is incredibly sound. I mean, the pill was the first mass-adopted, culturally celebrated technology designed specifically to completely override a fundamental, perfectly healthy biological function.
Wow, when you put it like that.
It severed the biological link between sex and reproduction. Once a society accepts the premise that human biology is merely a suggestion, a baseline that can and should be technologically altered for convenience, career, or preference, the philosophical door is kicked wide open.
Right. If I can alter my reproductive system with a pill, why can't I alter my gender with a scalpel and hormones? And if I can alter my gender, why can't I alter my cognitive limits? The conversation argues that this trajectory inevitably leads to literal technological transhumanism. They specifically reference Elon Musk's Neuralink, the physical merging of the human brain with computer hardware.
The ultimate override.
It is the steady, escalating progression of a society deciding that the human body is flawed hardware that needs a software update.
And this is where their analysis takes an incredibly dark turn. Marshall brings up a previous interview he conducted with the journalist Andy Ngugo, discussing a fringe group known as the Zizians.
Okay, we need to pause and explain this, because when I first heard Zizians, I had no idea what they were talking about.
It requires some unpacking, for sure. According to the context provided in the interview, the Zizians represent a highly intelligent, terminally online, post-humanist cult.
Okay.
These are individuals who often possess extremely high IQs, but who have become so immersed in abstract internet ideology that they view the physical flesh, the biological body, as a prison.
So they want out.
Yeah, they are accelerating toward a technological singularity. They're completely detached from traditional morality because traditional morality is based on human biological reality.
And the deeply alarming part is that Marshall notes this group is linked to real-world violence. He mentions a connection to several murders and suicides, specifically referencing the tragic death of a Border Patrol agent.
It's just awful.
It is a terrifying intersection.
Yeah.
Extreme high intelligence, an ideology that demands extreme body modification, and the rejection of humanity, resulting in fatal violence.
The speakers dig into a fascinating psychological theory here. The link between high intelligence, mental instability, and susceptibility to extreme ideology.
Tell me more about that.
Well, Marshall compares these hyper-intelligent internet cultists to ancient shamans. In a primitive tribe, the shaman was often the highly intelligent outlier, the person whose brain worked differently, allowing them to interface with the unknown, the abstract, or the spiritual.
Right.
But that same cognitive openness made them highly vulnerable to psychological collapse. Or, to use the Christian framework they operate in, it makes them vulnerable to spiritual possession.
That completely flips my understanding of how brainwashing works. We usually assume that smart people are immune to cults.
Right, that they'll just know better.
We think, oh, they have a high IQ, they'll see right through the lies. But the argument here is that intelligence does not grant immunity to ideological possession. In fact, it might make you vastly more susceptible.
Why is that?
Because you have the massive cognitive horsepower required to rationalize incredibly complex, fundamentally destructive belief systems. A person with an average IQ might look at transhumanism and say, that's weird, I'm going to go mow the lawn.
Yeah.
A genius will write a 400-page manifesto justifying why we need to upload our consciousness to the cloud.
Exactly. The intellect becomes a tool for the ideology. And this leads to the ultimate overarching question of their entire exchange. Is this massive cultural shift toward transhumanism, the dissolution of gender boundaries, and the breakdown of the family organic?
Is it natural?
Right. Is it just the messy result of human progress? Or is it being intentionally engineered?
Well, Blaire White does not mince words on this. She is firmly in the engineered camp.
Oh, yeah.
She argues that modern atheism and secular culture are top-down constructs pushed by a small, highly insulated elite class. She literally points out that average people laugh at the word Illuminati, but she notes that George Washington himself wrote letters expressing fear of such organized elite influence.
She goes all the way back.
She lists the World Economic Forum, the globalists in Davos, and what she calls the borderless class associated with the Epstein files as primary examples. She views them as a cohort that operates entirely above national loyalties, whose goal is to intentionally strip the working class society of its traditional religious and national grounding.
To intellectually support this theory of top-down engineering, Winston Marshall introduces a critical piece of historical philosophy, the post-war work of Karl Popper. And to understand this, we have to look at the psychological state of the world in 1945.
Right, Europe is in rubble. The Holocaust has just been exposed to the world. The intellectual class is reeling, trying to understand how civilized, technologically advanced nations built industrialized death camps.
Exactly. The trauma of World War II broke the mid-20th century intellectual mind. Philosophers like Karl Popper, specifically in his work The Open Society and Its Enemies, created a new dichotomy to try and guarantee fascism could never rise again.
What did he propose?
Popper essentially equated the quote-unquote good with absolute liberalism, open borders, untethered individualism, and total tolerance. He labeled these open societies.
Okay.
Conversely, he equated the bad, which meant fascism, Nazism, and authoritarianism, with any form of tribalism. And crucially, he categorized strong nationalism and strong traditional religion as dangerous, closed society traits.
Wait, so you're telling me that because the academics of the 1950s were so traumatized by the hyper-nationalism of Nazi Germany, they basically decided that any strong belief in borders or any strong belief in a traditional God was a gateway drug to fascism?
That is the exact argument Marshall is making. He argues that Popper's philosophy became the pervasive, unquestioned boomer ideology.
Wow.
The elite universities, the legacy media, and the political establishment spent the next 70 years internalizing this idea. They genuinely believed that deconstructing religion and borders was a moral imperative to prevent another Holocaust.
So they weren't necessarily being evil villains in their minds.
Right. Therefore, the top-down engineering White feels isn't necessarily a cabal of cartoon villains. It is the natural output of an elite class that was taught that tradition equals fascism.
Okay, but I have to jump in here and aggressively challenge this on behalf of you listening. It is incredibly easy and honestly psychologically comforting in a weird way to blame a shadowy elite in a smoke-filled room in Davos for why kids don't go to church anymore.
It gives you a bad guy to point at.
But isn't it vastly more likely that it's just human nature combining with extreme technological comfort? I mean, when you have antibiotics, central heating, Uber Eats, and an iPhone, you simply rely less on praying to God for a good harvest.
That's a very fair point.
When your life is comfortable and endlessly entertained, religion fades naturally. Why assume malicious top-down engineering when the natural progression of human laziness and technological distraction explains the decline of meaning perfectly well?
It's the Occam's razor argument. Don't attribute to malice what can be explained by iPhones.
Exactly.
The speakers actually wrestle with this exact tension. White concedes that it is a mix of both. The technological comfort creates a massive vulnerability, yes. But she leans heavily back into the organized element by pointing at the algorithms and the specific synchronized media messaging.
She doesn't think it's just a coincidence.
No, her argument is that if this shift were purely organic, you would see a chaotic, wide variety of cultural outcomes. Instead, you see a highly unified, homogeneous push across almost all elite institutions, corporations, universities, media, government, simultaneously promoting hyper-secularism and extreme gender ideology while actively mocking traditional family structures.
So it's coordinated.
She frames it essentially as spiritual warfare. The void was created by technology, but the poison filling the void is being pumped in intentionally by people who benefit from a rootless, atomized population.
And when you have a society that feels engineered, when you have a youth population stripped of traditional meaning, isolated by a pandemic, and then pumped full of highly optimized political propaganda via glowing screens, what is the ultimate result?
According to the deeply somber conclusion of their interview, the ultimate result is real-world, kinetic violence.
Yeah.
This brings us to the final and undoubtedly the most urgent section of their analysis, the cycle of radicalization and political violence.
Marshall points out a highly disturbing and historically relatively new phenomenon: a rise in violent crime and mass shootings perpetrated by trans individuals, specifically noting female-to-male individuals.
Marshall expresses genuine shock at this, noting that it defies almost all traditional criminological instincts.
Because historically, extreme mass violence, particularly school shootings, has been almost exclusively associated with biological males.
Exactly. To explain the sudden anomaly, the speakers propose a very specific, dangerous, compounding cocktail of factors.
They list three main ingredients to the societal powder keg. First, psychiatric medication, specifically the widespread use of SSRIs, antidepressants, and mood stabilizers, which the speakers note are heavily prevalent in these tragic cases.
I'll just skip one.
Second, the massive introduction of cross-sex hormones, like exogenous testosterone, into a female biological system. And third, and perhaps most crucially, the spark that lights the fuse intense algorithmic political radicalization.
We need to break down the mechanics of this radicalization because it explains the why. How do these three things interact?
Walk us through it.
You start with a brain that is already deeply struggling with dysphoria and mental anguish. You introduce powerful psychiatric drugs that alter serotonin and dopamine pathways. Then you pump in high levels of testosterone, which fundamentally changes the brain's aggression and risk assessment pathways.
Okay, so the biology is shifting.
Finally, you hand that physically altered, highly vulnerable individual a smartphone that tells them 24/7 that the government and their neighbors are trying to murder them.
Yes. Blaire White explicitly points out the rhetoric used by progressive media and politicians. They are constantly using phrases like transgenocide.
Constant fear-mongering.
She argues that these vulnerable kids are being told by authority figures they respect, mainstream news anchors, verified accounts, elected officials, that their literal physical survival is at stake.
And that is the biological trigger.
Yeah.
If you convince a marginalized, mentally fragile group of people that the society around them is actively trying to exterminate them, you completely bypass their prefrontal cortex, the logic center, and you trigger the amygdala.
The fight or flight response.
You trigger a biological fight or flight. In that state of induced terror, you completely remove their moral guardrails. Violence stops being categorized in their brain as a crime and becomes righteous, desperate self-defense.
We see the evidence of this ideological programming in what the speakers describe as copy-paste manifestos.
Right, the writings they leave behind.
White points out that when these shooters leave behind writings, they rarely contain original philosophical thought or deep personal coherent grievances. Instead, they read like a flat, robotic list of talking points pulled directly from a CNN broadcast or a radical social media feed.
Just echoing the algorithm.
It proves they aren't acting as independent agents. They are acting as the kinetic, violent endpoint of a massive algorithmic radicalization machine. They have been programmed to explode.
And the conversation broadens this out beyond just the trans community. They note that this artificial raising of the societal temperature is resulting in political violence across the board.
We've seen it everywhere.
They referenced the shooting at the White House Correspondent Dinner years ago, the recent assassination attempt on Donald Trump, and the suspect in the Los Angeles Palisades fire, who was reportedly inspired by the rhetoric of Luigi Mangione and anti-capitalist social justice themes.
The overarching diagnosis is a society where the baseline temperature is being intentionally held at a boil.
Which forces an incredibly difficult choice on the individual. When the society around you is actively radicalizing, when the algorithms want you to hate your neighbor, how do you respond?
Right. What do you actually do?
The interview offers a powerful counter-narrative through Blaire White's personal life choices. She reveals to Marshall that during the height of the COVID lockdowns, she fled California.
She went to Texas, right?
She moved to Texas to escape what she viewed as suffocating government overreach. But recently, she made the shocking decision to pack up and move back to California.
Marshall literally asks her if she's insane for doing that. Why go back to the belly of the beast?
But her reasoning is a profound rejection of the radicalization cycle. She explains that she realized she didn't want to just run from her problems and hide in a politically safe echo chamber.
She wanted to return to the center of the cultural storm to be part of the solution.
Yes. She talks about putting her energy into supporting local common-sense candidates like Spencer Pratt. But more importantly, she talks about her absolute, unwavering commitment to nonviolence.
She states that society is currently facing a stark binary choice talk or fight.
And despite the algorithms, despite the rhetoric, she is explicitly choosing to talk.
It's an inspiring stance, but it relies heavily on a defense mechanism she calls her inherent BS meter.
Her internal alarm.
She claims that because of her horrific childhood trauma, because she learned at a very young age what it looks like when adults in a cult lie to you to control you, she developed an immunity to modern political propaganda.
She sees right through it.
When people on Twitter or CNN tell her she's a victim in a genocidal war, her alarms go off, she recognizes the manipulation, and she refuses to internalize the fear.
She is relying on individual resilience to counter a systemic threat.
And that is exactly where I have to pause and ask you, the listener, to really put yourself in that scenario.
Yeah.
It is genuinely terrifying to think about a cocktail of hormones, pandemic isolation, and algorithmic fear-mongering creating a societal powder keg.
Absolutely terrifying.
Blaire claims her individual resilience, her hardened BS meter, protects her. But is individual resilience really enough to counter algorithmically optimized radicalization on a societal level?
That is the million-dollar question.
If the brightest engineers in Silicon Valley are spending billions of dollars using supercomputers to hack human psychology and keep us enraged and terrified, is it realistic to expect the average 13-year-old or even the average adult to just see through the BS?
Probably not.
Or are we relying on a biological defense mechanism that is hopelessly, comically outmatched by the technology of the offense?
That is the existential dread sitting at the very heart of this entire transcript. If Winston Marshall's theory of post-war top-down engineering is correct, if the structures that historically protected the individual from mass panic, like strong faith, stable family units, and local community, have been intentionally eroded by the boomer ideology, then the individual is left entirely exposed to the machine.
You are standing alone against a supercomputer designed to make you hate.
Yeah, we've covered a truly massive amount of ground today.
We really have. We've traced an incredible, sprawling narrative arc laid out in this deep, complex interview. We started with a child escaping a terrifying, bloodline-based occult cult, resulting in profound spiritual trauma.
We saw how that trauma birthed a highly individualized, fiercely independent brand of Christianity, a faith that actively rejects the physical church when it senses the same kind of institutional infiltration it witnessed in childhood.
We then watched how that cellular distrust of institutional religion mapped perfectly onto a deep skepticism of progressive medical and political institutions, specifically regarding the gender transition of minors and the devastating psychological fallout of the COVID lockdowns.
From there, the conversation scaled up into the philosophical stratosphere, warning us about the creeping normalization of transhumanism, the commodification of human biology through surrogacy, and a post-war elite ideology that actively sought to strip Western society of traditional meaning.
And finally, we saw the grim, real-world consequences of that meaning void. A vulnerable population pumped full of medication and algorithmic terror, resulting in tragic, inevitable political violence.
It is a profound, incredibly dark diagnosis of the modern condition. The ideological X-ray we talked about at the very beginning of the show is indeed fundamentally broken.
The clean lines of left and right are blurred, the old categories have failed, and the material suggests we are navigating entirely uncharted and heavily engineered cultural waters.
Which brings us to our final thought for today.
A little something for you to mull over as you go about the rest of your week. If the worldview we analyze today is right, if our modern society has systematically stripped away traditional meaning only to replace it with hyper-optimized political tribalism, outrage algorithms, and existential fear, then the ultimate act of rebellion might look very different than we think.
It's not what you'd expect.
The ultimate rebellion might not be a political vote. It might not be a viral social media post, or marching in a street, or moving your family to a different state to find an echo chamber, or winning a ferocious argument online.
If the system is designed to isolate you and make you view your neighbor as a mortal enemy,
then the ultimate rebellion might just be finding a way to sit in a physical room with someone you profoundly, fundamentally disagree with, looking them in the eye, and choosing to talk instead of fight. In a world that is technologically and politically optimized to keep you outraged and afraid, how are you protecting your own BS meter?
thanks for tuning in.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Exploring these complex, uncomfortable, and murky intersections of culture, psychology, and belief is exactly what this show is built for. Until next time, keep questioning the X-rays.